Yo, I'm Toycat, and this winter you'll finally be able to catch a high-speed train from the capital of France to the capital of Germany, and it will cost you just 59 euros and only take around 8 hours, which is actually shockingly slow, not just in the time that it takes, but the time that it took to get a high-speed service running, given that the Channel Tunnel was literally dug in the 90s. Not that in the UK we can really flex about our high-speed rail. We have one dedicated line, and it takes you from London to outside the UK, which some people would argue is the second best destination here, but I also think it's worth pointing out that, yeah, as a society, not just in the UK but worldwide, we have to work out where high-speed rail actually makes sense. We placed a whole bunch of rail lines all across this continent and really all across this world, and we did it at a time where the rail was just the logical way to get between places and when it really was connecting places up for humans. But now we have the car, which is more convenient, and the plane, which is faster, and both of those things have gotten a lot cheaper, and so now the only real way to compete is high-speed rail, which funnily enough is extremely expensive, and so it's hard to work out what is worth upgrading, what is worth building new lines for, and so I figured I would look at the 10 longest high-speed rail networks in the world and kind of show you what they look like to see the different ways you can decide where to connect up within your country, because your country's going to decide on this at some point, and now you get to know how and why. By the way, it's worth mentioning this will mostly be covering like domestic high-speed rail, but there are a few countries that are like the UK and only have one high-speed rail line going into another. Hungary and Serbia are both building a line to connect each other, and there's something fun about that European countries are close enough together that sometimes the most logical high-speed rail probably is to another European country. But you know what else is kind of logical? Korea's train network. Seriously, this is one of the most logical high-speed rail networks in the world, and yeah, there's basically two high-speed lines. The blue one, which goes from Seoul, the capital, to Busan, the second biggest city, and then there's a red spur, which comes off of Osong here, and then comes all the way down to Gwangju, which I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, and this is really interesting because on a map it sort of makes sense. Like, yeah, you're covering a decent amount of the country geographically, but also, if you look at one of those maps of Korea from space, they're meant to show you how, like, undeveloped North Korea is by comparison, but they also basically show you the big population centers, and fun fact, they hoovered up all of them with this line, and even though Korea is a country which is trying to administratively move as many of its people over to a brand new capital, you might have heard about this is the geography link in this channel, so South Korea is one of those countries trying to move its capital, and so Sejong is going to be the new capital, but despite getting hundreds of thousands of people to move here, and despite spending all this money building it, they haven't actually put it on the high-speed rail line, despite it being, like, tantalizingly close to it, and so it's just one of those fun examples of, like, politicians don't realize that if you want people to move somewhere, they need an easy way to get there, or you could argue it's the high-speed rail map being so logical that they say, no, we will not build a high-speed rail to a place, we're not going to spend all of that money until there are enough people there for it to be worthwhile. You can't put the high-speed rail before the horse, you know, you can't pull the high-speed rail before the high-speed rail, you can't pull the thing before the other thing because it's not going to work, something which is very logical when you look at Turkey's high-speed rail network, where, by the way, this is top 10, and it's kind of shocking that this was 9th, like, I was sure. If you look at Korea, look how much of their country is covered, and then if you look at Turkey, look how little of their country is covered, but Turkey is bigger than Korea, who would have figured? But what you probably wouldn't have figured is that Turkey would have any other high-speed rail lines besides Istanbul to Ankara. These are like the first and fourth biggest cities on the continent, although Ankara's on a different continent, so they're like some of the biggest cities in the area is my point, and they're so close together in the same country, it is such a logical high-speed rail line, there is no good reason to fly it if you make this any amount of fast, and ultimately that's why they probably did it. And then you can also say Konya, it's not a well-known city by international standards, but it's got over 2 million people living there, great choice as well, in my opinion, but the weirdest one is going out to Sivas, because, yeah, ultimately, one of the things that countries tend to do is you pick a really successful rail line, such as, say, Seoul to Busan, you make that successful, you make a lot of money, eventually, you know, you repay your investment, and then you say, wow, we can invest, we can connect places and provide benefit, but also provide some money, and then you think to yourself, maybe that would work with a place that doesn't have many people living there, and then you get a Turkey where Sivas gets its own high-speed rail station, and the only reason I can think that it does is maybe to connect to the east of the country, and further to the east, Iran, and Iran there too. I think that's interesting, but you know what else I think is interesting? Italy's high-speed rail map. Have you ever seen a map of Italy? They all prove the same thing, which is the south of the country is sad, and the north of the country is where the money's at, and that's, funnily enough, something you can see in the Italian high-speed rail map too. You can see that, yeah, there is some high-speed rail to the south here, going from Rome to Napoli, and also to Foggia over there, but you also can see, that's not the name of it, but yeah, what's interesting is you can also see, like, okay, in the north, that's where all of the high-speed trains are, and you start to see that, yeah, this is one of the downsides of a disconnected society, but also they're so close together that they actually probably do connect quite well if you run the right trains between the right points. It's not like a metro map where you can immediately understand where you can go from one place to another, but all the cities in the north are well connected, and the south is, well, as you can see from every other map, kind of sad by comparison. Speaking of sad by comparison, Finland has one of the most interesting high-speed rail maps in the world, because none of this is truly super high speed in the sense that most people are excited about, but it is faster than driving a car by some substantial amount, and it is basically only really high speed between Helsinki and Lat. I think that is a very interesting thing by itself, but then there's high-ish speed trains, which go between Helsinki and some of the other big cities, Turku and Oulu. It's very fun in my opinion, just how much the country has some amount of high speed, but you can see that there's this weird disconnection of lines here, and as I understand it, this is because it's largely upgrading existing lines. You can build a brand new line from scratch, which is a very logical thing to do for high-speed trains. There's very little overlap between a high-speed train and a regular train. Like, it's like, yeah, they both run on rails, but the way you do curves and the way you do signaling and the way you do everything else means that the trains aren't really compatible with each other if you do it correctly. And so it doesn't actually make a lot of sense if you have a huge amount of demand, but in Finland, that's not the case. And so they're just like, yeah, we'll just make some trains go faster, and that's sort of like high-speed rail, and it's faster than it's going to be faster than the rails were before. It's faster than cars are now, so it honestly works, I guess you could say. Where it's a much more exciting example is Germany's, where honestly you come to realize it's a networking problem. It's called, like, how do you if you have 5 computers, let's say, because Germany has 5 big cities: Berlin, Hamburg, then there's the big mess on the left here, but Cologne, Dusseldorf, etc., like the big western cities over there, then Frankfurt, and then Munich. They have 5 big city clusters, right? But they're all around the edge, and so the logical way to connect them would be one high-speed rail going around these. And so all of the highest speed, the 300-kilometer tracks, are going around the edges here to connect the cities. But if you wanted to go from, say, Hamburg to Munich, you don't want to go via Berlin, so they've got a whole separate line here. If you want to go from Frankfurt to Berlin, you don't want to go via Munich. That's such a huge detour, and high-speed rail is meant to be fast. And so you end up having to build a mesh network where you have to connect every city pair effectively. And because they're connecting every city pair, they can't all be the fastest 300km/h, like, you are zoom-in form of high-speed rail. And the only part of Germany where it feels like you're actually super insanely fast is Frankfurt to Cologne, as someone who's taken a few trains within Germany. Otherwise, it just feels like, yeah, you're on a pretty fast train. I imagine from Munich to Berlin, you get in there quickly and everything. But this is the only section where you're like, there is no reason to fly ever again. Everywhere else, it's like, yeah, it's a decent alternative. And that is one of the problems with having too many cities, something that will come up later when we come back to China. But in the meantime, here's the UK. I made fun of our high-speed rail network because it only has one dedicated high-speed rail line, but technically speaking, a lot of our other lines have done the same thing that I just mentioned, where we upgraded them, little by little, electrified, and then tying out all the curves, got some better trains, and now we can have trains that go faster than cars, trains that go 120 miles per hour, almost 200 kilometers an hour. It's really great in some cases, and it means that you can get to York, or you can get to Bristol in a couple of hours, if not less. It's really cool, I guess you could say. However, it's one of those networks that kind of has a little, like, I feel like as an outsider, it's good enough. As someone who lives in London and who doesn't have a car, it's the fastest way to get anywhere, basically all of the time. However, only by a little bit. This is like the bare minimum you need for a train network to be, for people who are going from city centre to city centre to think, yeah, I don't think I should use the car, but it's not fast enough for someone living around York or around Leeds or around Sheffield to be like, yeah, I'll drive half an hour in or catch a half an hour train in and then do the high-speed rail. That is, in my opinion, the real benefit of a fast enough system, and it's something that we're lacking in the UK. I believe we're building a second train line from London to Manchester, and it was meant to go to some other places, but then we said it was too expensive, and then we spent 100 billion on it anyway, and I have lots of feelings about that. But you know what else I have feelings about? The French train network, which I also think is fascinating because lots of people will criticize it for being too Paris-centric. Ultimately, when you're connecting the biggest cities in, say, Korea, you end up with a system that looks like this. If you connect the biggest cities or biggest city pairs in France, you end up with a system that looks like this. Every big, the biggest city that you can connect any city to is almost always going to be Paris. And so what do? They connect everything to Paris, including Geneva, including Milan, including Nice, It's definitely pronounced that way, including Barcelona. Yeah, it's the nicest way to pronounce it, honestly. But yeah, if you look around, you can see, like, yeah, it is a train network that connects into Paris and then not to each other. So London to, say, Barcelona, change in Paris. Also catch a metro across the city. Do you want to go from Stuttgart to Nancy's? Change in Paris. Train across the city. Even the most shocking ones of like, oh yeah, if you want to go from Bordeaux to Lyon, yeah, change in Paris. Believe it or not, go across the city. It's a train network that works great, again, from getting to the capital to anywhere else. And maybe if you're going from somewhere else to somewhere in between you and the capital, but it's a little rougher for basically everything else. Speaking of basically everything else, Shinkansen, or if you're talking about trains, you can't not have a little train gush moment for them. I think it's super cool that Japan is basically the country that made trains popular again, and the reason makes a bunch of sense. Like you have 100 million people living in a country this size, and that's already really dense population. But then if you ignore Sapporo as the islands to the north, if you just think about Kanto, the main island, it's already even more insane. And then if you remember that there's just a bunch of mountains here, do we have a fun layer map for that? If you remember that it's basically terrain, mountainous here, you get a really narrow sliver of population where people live, and so it makes sense to give them real high-speed trains, and so that's what Japan has done. They have a couple of like mini Shinkansens where they just run the Shinkansens on regular tracks, and they have a few situations where it's not as fast as otherwise, but otherwise this is the high-speed rail that got everyone excited about high-speed rail, and there's not that much I can say about it besides like, oh yeah, they're building an even faster one that's going to be made out of maglev. Gonna be real cool. They're gonna make everyone think about high-speed trains and go, yeah, that was stupid. Going only 200 miles per hour or 300 kilometers an hour, that's dumb when you can go 500 kilometers an hour. And I look forward to it. I do think it's one of the things you should be skeptical of if you're trying to build high-speed trains, which is that they're just in the same way that we built all of these rails across the world, which are now mostly just useful for freight, especially in North America. But even in much of the world, like once a rail connection isn't that useful anymore, it exists there forever, and it costs a huge amount to build. Ultimately, what if we hadn't built any rails until high speed? If we left the corridors open, right? We could just build the perfect tracks now. It would cost 1/10 of the price, and that is one of the arguments, is that you should just wait until technology comes out. I think it's a bad argument, but you know what's interesting? The Japanese high-speed train network is actually shorter than that of Spain. Spain's is a very goofy mess, which interestingly does the exact opposite of the UK or Hungary's, which is they specifically don't connect to their neighbor. I mean, they sort of connect to France, you could argue, in a very inefficient way, from Madrid at least. It's never any fun to go from Spain to France by train, but they don't specifically connect to Portugal, which I think is very rude to Portuguese people. Although, I did speak to a Portuguese person recently, and because, I asked them the question, I was like, okay, I'm sure as a Portuguese person this must annoy you, but I want to hear your response to, like, everyone looks at the Iberian Peninsula and says, why is it that Spain didn't just invade Portugal? It's a dumb question. They obviously have a lot of different history and culture, but I just asked them, like, why do you think that you aren't a part of Spain? And they said, honestly, Spain should just annex us. And so Spain, if you're watching this, I think you have permission from Portuguese people. Although, they're outside of Portugal, so maybe they don't agree with Portugal at all. Speaking of things that are in Portugal at all, it's worth mentioning that they are existing over here, but not with anywhere nearly as much high-speed rail as Madrid, or as Spain, which again all kind of links into Madrid. There's a common theme here that high-speed rail really benefits the big cities, and then maybe has some issues elsewhere, and that is something that you can sort of see in China. You mostly can't see it in China because there's just so many lines going everywhere, but China spent a lot of money and a lot of time and, man, a lot of political capital, I imagine, building a high-speed train network across their country, and people who are really in favor of rail. As someone who loves taking trains, I'd love to be like, yeah, look at this is great, we should be doing this in our countries, but there is a couple of things of this. One is the fact that it's still only efficient to get from some places to another. If you're starting in, say, Hong Kong, it's great to get to Shanghai if you have dozens of hours, because you are ultimately still covering ridiculous distances, and so even doing that at 300 kilometers an hour is still going to cause problems, especially if you're going from, say, Fingyang here to, like, over there. You're going to have to take lots of changes, and it becomes not the most efficient way for every city pair, and when you have so many city pairs, this is actually not as developed a high-speed rail network as you probably actually would love. And so what happens in China, despite this, is, I think it's shocking at least, is the fact that in China, China, as we can see from the center for aviation right here, they've got this fun graph of domestic passengers in China. It started at 200-ish million in 2010, and as they built more high-speed rail, the amount of demand for, domestic plane travel, i.e. ignoring that high-speed rail they're spending hundreds of billions on, it hasn't gone down. It's not that people are going, yeah, let's take a train instead of the plane. They're like, I will take the plane now more. The country is getting better connected, and that is objectively a good thing, but I also don't think that there's much of an environmental case, because as you get to a certain speed, you also start spending a lot of electricity. And my point here is to say is that high-speed rails are cool, but I think the environment argument and the like, we can replace planes, is a little bit of a weak one to make. I think the strongest argument for high-speed trains is they connect places better. They connect not only on a spiritual level. I mean, the UK and France are never as close as we've been after we shook hands through a weird tunnel we dug in the sea, right? I think there's a spiritual reason that we should connect ourselves via infrastructure like trains. There's the economic reason, which Korea definitely comes to, and but there's also, way more importantly, the argument that it is just of economic gain. I am someone who strongly believes that the more money people have, the happier they are, and if they can have more money and ride cool trains, then who's the loser? The answer is people who live in France and Germany, where you have to spend 8 hours to... Yeah, imagine spending 8 hours on a train. Imagine leaving, like 11:54, being all excited, getting on your train, and then spending 8 hours, and all you do is end up in France. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, with that said, thank you for watching. If you like videos about high-speed trains from a more casual perspective, then this probably isn't the greatest channel. I talk about lots of other things to do with geography, but if you like talking about the world and goofing off in Google Maps, then this is the channel for you, because I hope you will enjoy this video. Let me know what you thought about the maps in it, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye. Second channel, don't care.